I was 26 years old, and I had already buried a husband and lost a roof over my head in the same winter. The family I worked for had moved to Boston and taken their house with them, and what I had left was a canvas bag, a name nobody in Philadelphia knew how to pronounce, and the particular kind of steady that comes not from having nothing to lose, but from having already lost it. When a telegram arrived from a bureau in St. Louis about a widowed sheriff in Wyoming who needed someone capable, I wrote back in 2 lines and packed 1 bag. I did not go looking for a home, but I found one anyway, in the last place I would have thought to look and in the quietest way I have ever seen anything important happen. She did not bring much with her. A canvas bag, heavy at the bottom where she had packed the small iron skillet her mother had sent with her from Hanover when she crossed. A smaller bag held against her chest with both hands, the way a person holds something that contains what is left of who they were before. And 26 years of knowing that standing upright is a decision you make before the ground decides anything. The telegram had come on a Tuesday in early October, forwarded twice before it found her at the boarding house on Vine Street in Philadelphia, where she had been staying for 6 weeks in a room she shared with 2 other women and paid for by taking in mending. The room had no window that faced anything worth looking at, and the bed was narrow, and the small table by it was where she sat each morning and did the arithmetic of what she had left and what she owed, and what the 2 numbers meant when placed beside each other. She was 26 years old. She had come to Philadelphia from a farm in Lancaster County when she was 16, speaking more German than English, and she had learned the English by working in other people's houses, and she had married Heinrich Voss at 23 and buried him at 25. And what she had now was a widow's name, and a widow's particular kind of knowledge about how quickly a life can change its shape when the person who anchored it is gone. The telegram was from a bureau in St. Louis. A woman named Mrs. Pryor ran it from a small office and matched names to needs without sentiment, which was exactly the kind of operation Natalia appreciated. The listing had been plain. Sheriff, widower, house with a working stove, room enough, no debt, looking for someone capable, companionship, intent understood. Natalia had read it twice. Then she had written back in the same plain language. 26, widowed, no dependents, capable of most things, will arrive if the situation is as described. That last phrase, if the situation is as described. She had learned early that what a person wrote and what they meant were not always the same document. Her grandmother Oma had told her this when she was 7, sitting at the kitchen table in Hanover, with a letter from a cousin who said he was well. He was not well. You could tell Oma said by what a person did not say. The words are the door. What is behind it is the house. Natalia had been reading behind doors ever since. The train from Philadelphia to Cheyenne took 5 days. From Cheyenne, she transferred to a smaller line heading northwest into the Basin country, and the landscape changed in a way she had not expected. She had spent her life in Pennsylvania, and she had thought she understood what land looked like when it had room to breathe. She had not. This was different. The land here did not merely extend, it insisted. It pressed itself against the sky with a kind of blunt authority, and the sky pressed back, and there was no softness anywhere in the arrangement. She watched it from the window of the train, and she did not find it beautiful exactly. She found it honest. Harrow Flat came into view past a long curve in the track, a cluster of buildings against the pale brown of the Basin, a water tower, a church steeple, a main street that ran straight, and then stopped, as if it had simply run out of ideas. The train slowed. The platform appeared wooden boards, weathered to gray, and then she saw him. He was the only man standing alone. He held his hat in both hands, turning it slowly by the brim, and he was looking at the tracks, the way a man looks at something he has been waiting on long enough that the waiting itself has become a habit. He was tall and narrow through the shoulders in the way that men who have worked outdoors their whole lives sometimes are, as if the wind has been slowly editing them down to what is essential. His hair was gray at the temples and white above the ears. She put him at 67 or 68. She was the last passenger off the train. She came down the steps with the canvas bag over one shoulder and the smaller bag held against her chest, and she stood for a moment on the bottom step and looked at the platform and the street behind it and the sky above the roofline, which was the color of old pewter and moving from the northwest. Then she looked at him. She crossed the platform without waiting. She stopped 2 feet from him, set down the larger bag, and said, "You are the sheriff." It was not a question. He said yes. She nodded once, picked the bag back up, and waited. He walked her to the wagon without speaking. She did not seem to expect speech. The seat of the wagon was splintered at one edge, and she noted it without comment, and climbed up without waiting for a hand, which was the right way to handle it. He noticed her noticing. She noticed him noticing. Neither of them said anything about any of it. The town watched. She felt it the way you feel weather before it arrives. A woman at the window of the dry goods store, whose hand went still on the cloth she had been folding. 2 men on the steps of the hardware who stopped their conversation and did not resume it until the wagon had passed. A man she would later learn was Reverend Crail, standing at the corner of 2nd Street, with his hands clasped behind him, watching with the patient attention of a man who believes everything is eventually his concern. Calvin Marsh untied the horse, climbed to the bench, and turned them north toward the edge of town without looking at any of them. She sat with her smaller bag on her lap, held in both hands. She looked at the buildings as they moved through the main street. The general store, the assay office, the long, low front of the saloon with its 2 horses tied at the rail. Her eyes moved across each one without hurry. She was making an inventory. This was what she knew how to do. You looked at what existed and you worked from there. You did not spend time looking at what was missing. She had learned that on the farm in Lancaster County, when she was 12 and the harvest failed, and her father said, "Look at what is here, not at what is not. The missing things will not feed you. What remains might." She said, "It is smaller than I thought." He said yes. She did not ask if that bothered him. The road out of town was rutted and dry. The wind came harder out here, pressing the buffalo grass flat, and there was a smell on it, cold and clean and faintly mineral, nothing like Ohio. She watched the northwest sky. The clouds there had a weight to them that she recognized. Weather coming. 2 hours, maybe 3. He told her he had put her things in the back room, that there was a door with a latch, that a woman from the church had come earlier in the week to put clean linens on the bed. She said, "Thank you." The words were plain, not excessive. He seemed to register this. After a moment, she said, "The arrangement was for 1 year." He said yes. She said, "And after 1 year we decide." He said yes. She nodded and looked back at the road ahead. She had said the same thing to Mrs. Pryor in St. Louis. And Mrs. Pryor had looked at her with that particular expression that people use when they think you are not being realistic about something. Natalia had not tried to explain. Realism was not something she had learned from books or from other people's opinions about what a woman her age ought to expect. She had learned it from 4 years of watching young men die of things that should not have killed them, and from 22 years of marriage to a man who had been good in most of the ways that mattered and difficult in a few of the ways that did not, and from the particular education of being 26 years old in a country that had already decided it had no further use for you. She was not sentimental about any of it, but she was not bitter either. The house came into view past the second rise. It was low and square, built from timber that had darkened with age. One cottonwood tree to the east of it that would give shade in the afternoon when there was afternoon sun to speak of. A fence of rough-cut posts. A barn behind it, modest, the doors closed. She looked at it the way she had looked at everything since the train without a verdict yet, just measuring it against something interior that she could not have explained and did not try to. The first drop of rain hit the back of her hand on the rail of the wagon. By the time he drew up to the gate, the sky had gone the color of iron, and the air smelled of wet dust, and beneath that, something else. Something that reminded her of creek beds in late summer, before they ran again. He set the brake and climbed down, and she was already on the ground before he came around, her bag in hand, looking at the house the same way she had been since the second rise. He unlatched the gate and held it. She walked through. The front door was unlocked. He pushed it open and stood aside, and she stepped in and stopped just past the threshold, and her eyes moved across the room the way they always did, in unfamiliar spaces quickly, and without sentiment cataloging. The table and its two chairs placed at opposite ends. The stove black iron cold. The shelf with its 4 items, a tin of coffee, a tin of salt, a box of matches, a Bible she could tell had not been opened in some time, by the way the spine had lost its flex. The window on the east wall that would let in morning light. The floor swept clean. She set her bag down beside the table. Not in the center of the room, against the leg out of the way, she said, "Where do I sleep?" He showed her the second room. It was small. A cot with a quilt folded at the foot, a peg on the wall for coats, a window that faced south. He had swept it recently. The floor was still clean. She looked at the quilt, and she saw immediately what it was made from cloth taken from at least 3 different garments, possibly 4 pieced together with the particular care of someone who had been saving those scraps for a long time before they knew what they were saving them for. The stitching was fine. The tension was even. Whoever had made it had known what they were doing, and they had taken their time. She said, "Did you make it?" He said no. He said who had made it. Ruth, she thought. The name settled in the room alongside everything else. She nodded. And that was the end of the conversation. Outside, the rain found its rhythm, a steady sound on the roof on the single south-facing window. She set her smaller bag on the cot and stood a moment with her hands at her sides. Then she went back to the main room and found the larder. It was sparse but organized, the kind of order a man makes when he's accustomed to knowing exactly what he has and never having more than he needs. Salt pork wrapped in cloth. A sack of flour half gone. A tin of coffee nearly full. A jar of rendered fat. A small paper of salt. 2 onions beginning to soften at the heel, but still good through most of their body. She stood at the larder door and looked at what was there, and she was already calculating. Not what she wished were there. What she could do with what was. This was also something she had learned in her grandmother Oma's kitchen, and in the houses she had worked in, and in the particular winter after Heinrich died, when there had been very little, and she had learned to work with what was in front of her, and not look at what was missing. She found the skillet on a hook by the stove. Set it over the heat after she had built the fire from the wood stacked neatly by the back wall. The pork she cut thin. She had done this in worse kitchens. She had done this in tents with dirt floors and no walls, and men bleeding onto the ground around her feet. And she had kept her hands steady because her hands had a job to do, and steadiness was not a feeling. It was a decision. The fat began to render. The smell of it filled the small room in the way that food smells do, the way that can make an unfamiliar place begin to lose some of its edges. She heard him at the door. He came in without announcement. The door opened, and she heard his boots on the threshold, and then the sound of him stopping. She did not turn from the stove. The pork needed watching. She heard him hang his coat, then stillness. He said, "You did not need to do that." She moved the skillet to the cooler side of the grate. She said, "The salt pork needed using." A pause. The good kind. He was the kind of man who let a pause be what it was. She heard him pull out the chair at the far end of the table. Not the closest one. The far end. As if he were being careful about something that had no name yet. She plated the food on the tin she had found near the wash basin, set the bread beside it, and brought it to the table and placed it in front of him, without ceremony, the way you set a thing down when it simply needs to be set down. She took her own plate back to the stove and ate standing, which she had done so often in her life that it felt more natural than sitting. For a time there was only the rain on the roof and the sound of eating, and somewhere down the street a door pulling shut against the wind. She was halfway through her plate when he spoke. He said, "The quilt. In your room." She waited. He said, "It was my wife's. Ruth made it the winter before she died. She used what she had, saved cloth for years before she put it together." Natalia did not say she was sorry. She had said sorry to too many people in her life to believe it was the right word for most situations. It was too small. It gave the person who received it nothing useful to do, she said. She knew how to choose. She put the worn parts where they would support each other. That is why it is still whole. He looked up from his plate. She held his gaze without challenge and without softness. She had learned that particular expression in the houses of other people, in rooms where she had needed to hold her ground without making an enemy. It was not the look of a woman who wanted to be understood. It was the look of a woman who was simply being accurate. He looked back at his plate. He said, "Yes." That was all. She ate the rest of her supper. The fire had settled into a low, even heat. The rain did not stop, but it changed quality. Lighter now, more steady. The kind that might go on all night without anyone being troubled by it. When she stood to take her plate to the basin, she noticed the candle on the windowsill. It had burned most of the way down, not tonight. The wax had pooled and cooled again, many times building up in layers on the tin holder, the kind of accumulation that took not days, but months, possibly longer. She looked at it for a moment, this candle that had been burning in this room long before she arrived. Then she turned to the basin and washed her plate and his without being asked and set them both on the shelf beside the tin of coffee. He said goodnight from the doorway of the stairs. She said goodnight. She went to her room and she lay in the dark on Ruth's cot, under Ruth's quilt, and she listened to the rain on the south window, and she thought about the candle. She did not think about it with worry. She thought about it the way she thought about wounds she had not yet diagnosed. There was information there. She did not yet know what it meant. She slept. She woke before the house did, which she expected. She had been waking before houses since she was 12 years old, and it was not a habit she had ever lost. The room was dark and cold, in the particular way of a place that has not yet decided what kind of day it will be. She rose and dressed without hurry and went to the kitchen. The candle on the windowsill was burned to nothing. The holder was a plain tin thing, dented on one side, the kind of object that has been carried from room to room for so long that no one can remember where it started. She looked at it for a moment. Then she began laying the fire. By the time she heard his boots on the floor above the stove was going, and the coffee was on, and she had found in the lower cabinet a small sack of cornmeal that was still good. He came downstairs without announcement. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the stove, and then at her, and then at the window where the pale gray of early morning was just beginning to arrive through the glass. He said, "You did not need to." She did not answer that. There was no useful answer to it. He sat at the table, and she set the coffee in front of him, and he wrapped both hands around the cup, and she understood without being told that he was cold in a way that had very little to do with the temperature of the room. She had seen that before. She knew what it looked like. Her grandmother Oma had a word for it in German that did not translate well, but meant something like the cold that lives in the chest and has nothing to do with the season. Oma had said once, watching a neighbor who had lost his son, that some men carry cold in them like a stone, and no fire outside them will warm it. The cold has to find a reason to leave on its own terms. You cannot take it from him. You can only make the room warm enough that he might eventually choose to let it go. She had been perhaps 8 years old when Oma said it. She had never found a better instruction. She made the cornmeal at the stove and did not watch him. After a while, he said, "Tom Fletcher will come by this morning." She turned slightly. He was looking at his cup. "He comes every Thursday," Calvin said. "He is on the town council." He paused. "He will have questions." She understood what he was telling her. Not about the questions, about the fact that the questions were coming and that they would require something from her. The town had been watching since the platform. She had felt it, the shape of it, the particular way a small place observes a stranger and waits to see what category to put them in. She said, "What kind of questions?" He said, "The kind where the answer matters less than how steady you are when you give it." She put the cornmeal in a bowl and set it on the table and sat down across from him for the first time. She said, "I am steady." He looked at her, then the way he had looked at her the night before when she spoke about the quilt. Something that was not quite assessment. Something that had not yet found its name. He said, "I know." The plainness of it was not a compliment. She understood that. It was a statement of observation made by someone who had been watching quietly for a while before saying anything. She found she respected it. They ate. The pale gray at the window became something closer to yellow as the morning arrived. Somewhere down the street, a door opened and closed. The cat appeared. The cat. She had not seen the cat before. It came from behind the wood bin in the corner of the kitchen. A large gray thing with one torn ear, in the particular expression of an animal that has decided to reserve judgment indefinitely. It sat at the edge of the room and looked at her. She looked back. She had learned early not to make sudden gestures toward things that were uncertain of her. Oma had taught her that, with animals with frightened children, with men who did not yet know what they were going to do. The cat sat with her for a long time. It did not come closer, but it did not leave. After a while, Calvin put on his coat and took his hat from the nail by the door. He said he had a round to finish before the councilman arrived. She said that would be fine. He went out without ceremony, and the door closed behind him, and she was alone in the room with the stove, and the sound of the rain that had not stopped in the night, and the gray cat watching from the corner. She sat for another minute. Then she stood, and took a small piece of the salt pork rind from the cloth in the larder and set it on the floor near the wood bin without approaching the cat directly. She went back to the table and sat down. The cat looked at the rind, then it looked at her. Then it crossed the room in its own time and ate the rind and returned to its place by the wood bin and sat down again. Nothing had been decided, but something had been noted. Tom Fletcher arrived at 9:30. He was a square man in a good coat, the kind of man who wore his position on the town council, the way other men wore their Sunday shirts visibly and with attention to fit. He had a politician's face open and arranged. He shook her hand with both of his and said he was delighted to welcome her to Harrow Flat and that he hoped the journey had not been too taxing. She said it had been fine. He sat at the table where she placed coffee in front of him, and he talked about the town for several minutes. Its history, its prospects, the railroad spur that was coming, God willing, in the next few years. She listened with the part of her attention that tracked content and observed him, with the rest the part trained in other people's parlors and kitchens to read what people were not saying, while they were busy saying something else. What he was not saying was the question he had actually come to ask. He got to it eventually. He said he wanted to make sure she understood that Harrow Flat was a community with certain expectations. He said it in a kind way, a way that had been practiced. He said that the people of the town had a great deal of respect for Calvin Marsh, who had served them well, and that they naturally took an interest in his circumstances. She said, "I understand." He said, "The arrangement as it stands," she said, "is that I keep the house and cook and have a room until matters are settled properly. That is all there is to it, Mr. Fletcher." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely place. Then he nodded once and picked up his coffee cup. She held his gaze the whole time. She had learned that in the houses she had worked in, not from anyone who had taught it directly, from watching, from the women who managed other people's households without title or authority, and who held their ground in rooms full of people who believed they ran everything. You kept your voice level. You did not apologize for taking up the space you were standing in. It was not aggression. It was simply the refusal to make yourself smaller than the room required. He left after 20 minutes. She stood at the door and watched him go down the path and through the gate, and she thought about what he had come to find out and whether she had given him what he needed. She thought she had. Not the truth exactly, but the shape of something he could work with, something that would not require further intervention. Not yet. She went back inside. The cat had moved while she was at the door. It was now sitting on the floor beside the table leg where she had set her bag the night before, in the same spot as if it had decided the spot was worth claiming. She did not say anything to it. She sat down at the table and opened the smaller bag that she had been carrying against her chest since Philadelphia. She took out the few things inside it. A small photograph in a paper sleeve of her husband in his Sunday coat, taken the year before he died. A folded letter from her brother Elias, written 8 months ago from Lancaster County. The last letter that had reached her before she moved. A small cloth case that held the mending scissors and the fine needle holder that had been Oma's, brought from Hanover and pressed into Natalia's hands the morning she left the farm for Philadelphia. She had used them for everything from hemming to fine embroidery, and she kept them because they were the best-made tools she had ever owned, and because they reminded her of Oma's hands doing the same work before her. And at the bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief, a ball of heavy gray wool she had bought at a shop in Philadelphia the week before she left. She had not known when she bought it what she intended to make with it. She had simply known she needed to be doing something with her hands when she arrived somewhere new. something that built on itself row by row, without any single moment being the one that made it what it was. She set the wool on the shelf above the mending basket which she had found in the corner of the second room that morning. She looked at it there against the raw wood of the shelf. Then she stood and found the hammer in the small wooden box beneath the work table, and she went to the back door and knelt and drove the 3 loose nails she had identified that morning back into the bottom rail where the draft came through 4 strikes, each clean and even. She tested the seal with her hand. The draft was gone. She put the hammer back. She went to the second room and looked at the staircase. The second step was loose. She could tell by the wear pattern on the wood, but the way the nail had worked itself up just enough to catch. She noted it for later. She did not have time before noon, and she did not like to rush a thing that needed doing properly. She stood in the doorway of the second room for a moment, looking at the cot and the quilt and the peg on the wall where she had hung her second dress. Then she opened the small drawer in the bedside table to look for a candle holder because the room had none, and instead she found something she had not been looking for. It was in the back of the drawer, pushed to the rear, as if placed there by someone in a hurry, or by someone who needed it to be out of reach but not entirely gone. A folded piece of paper. Not a letter. Not a legal document. A list. Written in a woman's hand, small and careful. The letters formed with the kind of attention that comes from someone who had taught herself to write later than most, and was still proud of the doing of it. The list said flour, when low-salt pork, wrapped in cloth, not paper. Coffee tin on left side of shelf wood inside before the first frost. Loose nail on back step needs seeing to come spring. At the bottom, a date. October of 4 years prior. And the name Ruth written in the same small, careful Horse-Pantone. Natalia stood with the paper in both hands and looked at it for a long time. She thought about the woman who had written it. A woman who had known she was running out of time and had spent some of that time writing down the practical things, the ordinary maintenance instructions for a house she would not be there to maintain. Not for herself, for whoever came after. She thought about what it meant that Calvin Marsh had never opened this drawer. She folded the paper and placed it back exactly as she had found it in the rear of the drawer, pushed to the edge. She closed the drawer carefully. She stood with her hands at her sides for a moment in the small, cold room. Then she went back to the kitchen and began the noon meal, because the noon meal needed making, and she was the one who was there to make it. And outside, the rain was letting up at last, and the pale winter light was beginning to come through the east window and lie in a long rectangle on the floor, and the gray cat was still sitting beside the table leg, and the wool was on the shelf, and the house was a place she did not yet know, but was beginning to learn the shape of one room at a time, one loose nail at a time, one cold draft sealed against the coming winter. She started counting that afternoon, not because she had decided to. It was simply a thing her mind did when she entered a new place. A habit from the crossing and from the early months in Pennsylvania when the days had blurred together, until counting them was the only way to stay inside herself. She had counted through the weeks of learning English, and through the first year in Philadelphia, and through the long, bewildering months after Heinrich died, when the days had felt interchangeable, and marking them had been the only way to stay inside herself. She counted the way other people breathe, without deciding to. Day 1, she thought setting the kettle on the stove. She did not know yet what she was measuring, but she thought she would figure that out in time. She counted 17 days before the snow came. Not all at once. The way it always arrived in that part of Wyoming, tentatively at first, a few flakes that looked uncertain about their purpose, then more, than the kind that meant it. She had been watching the sky since morning, and she had known by noon what the afternoon would bring, the way you know a patient is turning before the numbers tell you. She brought 3 armloads of wood inside before Calvin returned. She checked the draft on the stove. She put a pot of beans on low because beans made sense when the cold had decided to stay. When he came in at dusk, he stopped inside the door and looked at the wood stacked near the stove, and then at the pot. And then he hung his coat on the hook and said nothing about either of those things, which by now, she understood, was its own kind of language. They had developed in 17 days a way of living in the same house that required very little negotiation, because they had each independently arrived at the same conclusion about how space ought to be used. You did not crowd it. You did not fill it with unnecessary sound. You left the other person room to be what they were, without requiring them to explain it. She had lived with her husband that way for the last 10 years of their marriage, after the particular peace that sometimes comes to 2 people who have worn through the difficulty of each other and arrived at something quieter on the other side. She had not expected to find that quality again, certainly not in a stranger, certainly not this quickly, but she recognized it when she encountered it, the way you recognize a plant you have not seen since childhood, not by name, but by something more basic than name. The gray cat, whose name she had learned, was simply the cat, because Calvin had never given it. One had moved from the corner by the wood bin to the rug near the stove. It slept there in the evenings now. It had come to her knee twice while she was sitting, once pressing its head briefly against her hand before withdrawing to assess whether this had been a mistake. She had not reached for it. She had simply let her hand rest there, available if it was wanted. On the 18th day, she fixed the second stair. She found a suitable length of shim in the small pile of wood scraps behind the barn, cut it to size with the handsaw that hung beside the back door, and drove it into place with 4 clean strikes of the hammer. She tested it with her full weight, which was not inconsiderable. It held. She put the hammer back and went inside and washed her hands at the basin. That evening, Calvin came upstairs and his step paused at the second stair, just for a moment. The particular pause of someone who was prepared for something that was no longer there to prepare for. He came to the table and sat down. She set his plate in front of him. He said after a moment, "The stair." She said, "It was loose." He was quiet. She heard him set down his fork, then pick it up again. He said, "Thank you." She said nothing. It was not the kind of thing that needed an answer. She had noticed over those 18 days that Calvin Marsh moved through his own house with the careful attention of a man who had learned to keep track of what was different, not because he was suspicious, but because difference had once meant something to him, and the habit had remained, after the reason for it was gone. He noted things. The way the draft had stopped at the back door. The way the shelf above the mending basket now held the gray wool. The way the tin of coffee was always full in the morning, because she had started buying it from Edna Whitlock's store on Thursdays. He did not comment on most of it, but she knew he saw it. She saw him seeing. On the 22nd day, she went to Edna Whitlock's store for cornmeal and thread and a second tin of salt, and Edna looked up from the counter with the particular kind of attention that is not quite unfriendly, but has not yet decided what it is. Edna said, "You are the woman at Calvin's house." She said, "I am." Edna set her hands flat on the counter. She was perhaps 55, with pale eyes, and a directness about her that Natalia appreciated because it was not performance. It was simply how she was. Edna said, "People talk. I am not telling you anything you do not already know." Natalia said, "I know." Edna said, "A woman alone his house. People will want to understand the arrangement." Natalia looked at her steadily, at the whole face, the way Oma had taught her to read a person. Not the eyes alone, but the whole arrangement of them. She said, "The arrangement is that I keep the house and cook." He gave me a room while matters are settled. That is all there is." Edna was quiet for a moment. She folded a cloth on the counter and then unfolded it again. She said, "He is a decent man." It did not sound like a warning. It sounded like the conclusion of one. Natalia paid for the cornmeal and the salt and left the thread because she found she was 2 cents short, and she did not ask for credit on a second visit. Outside, the light was hard and pale, the kind of winter light that gives everything a thin, accurate edge. She stood on the board sidewalk with her paper bag held against her coat, and she thought about what Edna had said and what she had not said. She walked back through the quiet street. Calvin was not at the house when she returned. She put the cornmeal away and stood at the window that faced the back lot where the split wood was stacked against the fence. He had added to it that morning. She had not heard him do it. She had only noticed after the new lengths at the top where the old wood had darkened. She did not know very much about him, not yet. Not in the way you come to know someone through accumulated conversation. What she knew was the pattern of him. The coffee left at the edge of the stove so it would stay warm but not scorch. The door checked twice before he sat down in the evening. Not from nervousness, but from the habit of a man whose job required that locks and latches were not theoretical. The way he always knew where she was in a room without appearing to look, which was not unsettling. It was simply the particular awareness of someone trained to account for what was around them. These were the things she had collected. They did not add up to a portrait. They added up to something else. Something she thought about while she washed the morning dishes or moved the beans from the center of the grate to the cooler edge. Her mother had a German word for it once, about a floor you had tested by walking on it many times until you no longer thought about whether it would hold. Not trust exactly. Something you arrived at through the body before the mind had finished its deliberations. She had tested this particular floor carefully. So far, it had held. On the 29th day, Reverend Crail came to the house. He came in the afternoon, which she thought was deliberate. Calvin was out on his rounds. She answered the door and looked at him and said, "Good afternoon," and invited him in because there was no reasonable alternative. He sat at the table where she placed coffee in front of him, and he talked for a while about the community and its values. He was not malicious. She could see that. He was a man who believed genuinely in the order he represented, and who was genuinely uncertain about what category she belonged in and who was doing what men in his position did when they encountered something they could not immediately categorize. He was gathering information. He said, "We are glad to see Calvin with some company," she said. "That is kind." He said, "A house should not be empty too long." She said no. He said carefully, "It is only that people want to be sure the situation is as it appears." She looked at him across the table. She thought about what Calvin had said in the first week. The answer matters less than how steady you are when you give it. She said, "I have kept houses for other people since I was 16. Reverend, I know what a working arrangement looks like and what it is not. This one is what it appears to be. I keep the house. He does his work. We are being sensible about things." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not fully read. Then he nodded and picked up his coffee, and they talked about the weather for 5 more minutes, and he left. She stood at the closed door after he was gone, and she thought that is not the end of it. Men like Reverend Crail did not close a question. They postponed it and came back to it from a different direction when they thought you had relaxed. She went back to the table and picked up the gray wool from the shelf and sat down and began to cast on. She had decided sometime in the previous week that it would be a scarf, long enough for a tall man. She had not examined that decision closely. It was simply where the math of the yarn and the weight of the cold had led her, and she had learned long ago not to interrogate the obvious too hard. She worked 3 rows before Calvin came in. He stopped at the door the way he always did, taking stock of the room before entering it fully. He looked at her at the table with the wool in her hands. He hung his coat. He poured a cup of coffee from the pot she had left on the stove. He stood at the window with it, looking at the back lot where the wood was stacked, and the silence between them was the kind they had both learned to inhabit without discomfort. After a while, he said without turning, "Crail came by." She said, "He did." He turned, then not all the way, just enough. He said, "What did he want?" She said, "The same thing Tom Fletcher wanted. To see whether I was the kind of trouble that needs managing, or the kind that takes care of itself." He was quiet a moment. He said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "That I have been keeping other people's houses since I was 16, and I know the difference between an arrangement and a problem." He looked at her. She pulled the next row through and felt the particular give of the fiber, under tension, the way each stitch locked the one before it into place, building something out of nothing, 1 row at a time, without any single moment being the moment that made it what it was. He turned back to the window. He said, "That would do it." She said, "I thought it might." The snow that night was serious. She lay in the second room under Ruth's quilt and listened to it work on the roof, and she thought about the scarf, and about Crail, and about the shape of a town that was still deciding what she was. She was not afraid of that process. She had been assessed by harder rooms than this one. The families she had worked for who had spoken about her in rooms she was standing in as if she were a piece of furniture. The women in Philadelphia who had told her a widow her age should be grateful for any arrangement at all. She had outlasted all of them simply by continuing to do the work in front of her and not requiring anyone's permission to find it worthwhile. She thought too about the candle. Every night since the first she had seen Calvin light it at the window before he went upstairs, a motion so quiet and habitual that it would have been easy to miss if she had not been paying the kind of attention she had always paid to things that happened repeatedly without explanation. She had not asked about it yet. She was still collecting information. What she had not anticipated was Alderman Gideon Parr. He was not, she would learn, a man who came to the door. He sent for Calvin instead. On the 31st day, Calvin came home in the middle of the afternoon, which he had never done before. She heard his horse in the yard, and then his boots on the porch, and something in the particular weight of those footsteps told her the afternoon had changed character before he opened the door. He sat at the table without taking off his coat. She set coffee in front of him and sat down across from him and waited. She had learned in the months after Heinrich died that there was a kind of news that needed to be given room to arrive at its own speed, and that filling the space before it arrived only pushed it further away. He said after a long moment, "Parr called a meeting of the council this morning." She waited. He said, "He is requiring documentation of marriage within 60 days, formal and legal. He says it is a matter of public order." She looked at the surface of the table, the grain of it, the places where use had worn the finish thin. She said, "And if not?" He said, "You would be asked to leave the county." She said, "What does Parr want with the council?" He was quiet a moment. She could see him deciding how much to say. He said, "There is a piece of land north of town I have been holding on a grant from before the war. Parr has been trying to buy it through intermediaries for 2 years. A sheriff with a reputation problem is easier to replace than one without." She looked at him. She said, "So I am a reputation problem," he said, That is what he is trying to make you. She sat with that for a moment. She was not angry. Anger was an indulgence she had never had time for, and she was too old to start now. What she felt was something more like the particular clarity that comes when a situation has finished, pretending to be something other than what it is. She said, "You should have told me sooner." He said, "I know." She said, "I am not asking for an apology. I am asking you not to do it again." He looked at her. That same look, the one without a name yet. Something between recognition and something else she had not catalogued. He said, "All right." She nodded. She stood and went back to the stove. She adjusted the beans. She could feel him still at the table behind her, the particular weight of a man sitting with something he does not know how to put down. She did not tell him she already knew. Deputy Orrin Fitch was 26 years old and had the kind of loose, unguarded face that makes a man a poor keeper of other people's information. She had learned about Parr's ultimatum 4 days earlier from a conversation Fitch had conducted at what he apparently believed was a private volume near the far end of Edna's counter, while Natalia was standing 2 aisles away selecting dried beans. She had finished her selection and paid, and left without giving any indication that she had heard a single word. The following morning, she had sat at the table for a long time with the wool in her hands, and she had thought about what the 60 days meant, and what the alternatives were, and what she was willing to do, and what she was not. She had done this kind of thinking before. You laid out the facts the way you laid out instruments before a procedure. Everything in its place, nothing hidden from yourself. The facts were these. She was 26 years old. She had come here because she had nowhere else to go that did not involve diminishment. She was not in love with Calvin Marsh, and he was not in love with her, and that was not the point of what was being built here, whatever it was. What was being built here was something more basic than love, and possibly more durable. She did not want to lose it to a man who wanted a piece of land, but she also did not want to be the reason Calvin lost his position. She had not resolved this. She was still turning it when he finally told her himself, on the 31st day, and she had found sitting across the table from him, that the resolution was still not fully in reach. She picked up her count that evening with the wool in her lap. Day 31. 29 days remaining. She turned the number over the way she turned difficult diagnoses, not with dread, but with the particular attention of someone who has learned that the worst thing is usually not the thing itself, but the time you spend not looking at it directly. The scarf grew in the evenings. The gray wool moved through her hands steadily, each row building on the one before it. The cat had taken to sitting near her feet while she worked, not on her lap, near her feet, which was the cat's particular expression of a preference it was not yet prepared to fully commit to. Outside, the snow settled over Harrow Flat, and the house held its warmth, and somewhere in the dark of the basin, the winter was only beginning what it had planned. On the 35th day, Reverend Crail gave his Sunday sermon. He did not name her. He was too careful for that. But the text he chose was the one about the stranger at the gate, and the way he delivered certain phrases with a small, deliberate emphasis that was meant to be noticed made it clear enough to everyone in the pews what the subtext was. She sat in the 3rd row from the back, where she had sat every Sunday since arriving, and she listened with her hands folded in her lap, and her face arranged in the expression she had developed over 40 years of listening to men say things that required a response. She was not permitted to give in the moment. She had been in that church 5 times. She had spoken to perhaps 11 people in it. She had not made herself known through conversation. She had made herself known the way she always made herself known, through the work of her hands and the steadiness of her presence. and the fact that when she said she would do a thing, she did it, and when she said she would not, she did not. Edna Whitlock was sitting 4 rows ahead of her. When Crail arrived at the third emphasis, Edna stood up. She did not raise her voice. She said clearly, in the particular tone of a woman who has made a decision and is carrying it out, I have been in that house. The stove burns clean, and the floor is swept, and the back step does not give anymore. That is what I have to say about the stranger at the gate. Then she sat down. Crail stopped. He looked at Edna. He looked at his text. He moved to the next passage. He did not return to the stranger. Natalia looked at the back of Edna's head, the neat gray bun at the nape of her neck, and she thought about the ball of blue-gray yarn Edna had sent with Calvin 3 weeks earlier, the one now becoming this scarf. And she thought that some people showed you who they were through words, and some people showed you through what they sent to you wordlessly on a cold afternoon, and she had always found the second kind more reliable. After the service, Edna found her on the steps. Edna said Parr has been talking to the other aldermen. Natalia said, I know. Edna said, he has 2 of them, possibly 3. Natalia said, how many does he need? Edna said, 4 of 5 for a formal removal. Natalia nodded. She looked at the street, the particular hard brightness of a Wyoming morning in November. Everything defined and cold. She said, what does Crail do? Edna said, he has not decided. She said, then he has decided. He just has not said it yet. Edna looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite a smile. She said, Calvin did not tell me you were like this. Natalia said, Calvin has not had enough time to tell you much of anything. Edna said, no, I suppose not. They stood on the steps a moment. The congregation moved past them. Edna said quietly, there is going to be a formal session. Parr has already called it. 3 weeks out. Natalia said, I see. Edna said, what will you do? Natalia thought about that question carefully. Oma had once said that when you do not know what to do not choose what seems right now. Choose what gives the situation the best chance at what comes after. She said, I will do what I have always done, the work in front of me. Edna looked at her for another moment. She said, all right, I will see you Thursday. She went down the steps and across the street and back to her store, which she opened on Sundays for an hour after services, because people needed things on Sundays, the same as any other day, and pretending otherwise had always seemed to her a peculiar kind of vanity. In the days that followed, Natalia kept to the work. There was always work. The Henderson family lived 4 houses down from the church, and she had noticed for 2 weeks that the flashing on their roof had come loose along the north edge, the kind of thing that looks minor until the first heavy snow finds the gap and decides to become a problem from the inside. She went there on a Tuesday morning, before breakfast with the tools from Calvin's wooden box, and spent an hour on the roof repacking the flashing before the Hendersons had finished their morning meal. Mr. Henderson came out while she was climbing down and looked at her with an expression she had seen before, the particular combination of gratitude and uncertainty that comes when someone has done something for you that you did not think to ask for. She said, the angle was wrong. It would have gone through by January. He said I did not know you could do that. She said, most things can be done if you have done them before. She put the tools back and walked home. 3 days after that, Clara Deary sent word through a neighbor's child that she was unwell and could not get to the store. Natalia did not know Clara Deary well. She had spoken to her twice, once at church and once on the street, and both times Clara had been pleasant in the careful way of someone who has not yet decided how much pleasant to extend. But unwell was unwell, and soup was soup, and Natalia made a pot of both and brought it to Clara's step that afternoon, and then again the next morning when the neighbor child came to say Clara was no better. Clara was 61 and lived alone since her husband, Alderman Deary, spent most nights at the council house going over land filings with Parr. She received the soup each morning without excessive comment, which Natalia respected. On the third morning, Clara opened the door herself, upright and dressed, and said, "I did not tell anyone I was ill." Natalia said no. Clara said, "How did you know?" Natalia said, "You are not at church. You are always at church." Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she took the soup and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Voss." It was the first time anyone in Harrow Flat had called her that. She walked home through the early cold and thought about what it meant to be seen by a place, and whether being seen and being known were the same thing, and decided they were not, but that one sometimes led to the other if you were patient enough to wait for it. The post office steps had been dangerous since early November. Horace, who ran the post office, was a careful man about most things, but had apparently decided that the icy angle of the bottom step was not his problem to solve. Natalia began putting sand on it each morning when the temperature dropped overnight on her way back from the store or from wherever the morning had taken her. She did not tell Horace. She simply did it and moved on. On a Wednesday morning in the middle of the 5th week, a young woman came to the house with a child of about 7 who had cut his hand on a fence nail. The doctor was out on a call 3 counties over and would not be back until evening. Natalia cleaned the wound at the kitchen table, assessed the depth, and closed it with 3 stitches using the fine needle holder from her cloth case, the one that had been Oma's. The child did not cry. She told the mother to keep it dry for a week and to watch for heat along the edges, and if heat came, to find her before finding anyone else. The mother said afterward, "Where did you learn to do that?" Natalia said, "From my grandmother. She said hands that know a needle know most things if they are paying attention." The mother looked at her hands and then at her face and said nothing more. But something had shifted in the particular way she held herself toward Natalia, the way a door shifts when someone has decided to leave it open rather than closed. On the 40th day, she found old Mr. Prosser. He lived alone on the north edge of town in a house that had been built for a larger family and now held only him and his stove, and the considerable accumulation of a life lived in one place for too long to easily subtract anything from it. She had passed his house a dozen times without seeing him at the window or in the yard. And on the 40th morning, the absence of him had become specific enough that she knocked. He was ill with nothing serious, but ill nonetheless, the kind of winter chest cold that in a man of 73 becomes a more significant matter than it would in someone younger. He had wood enough, but had not been managing the stove well, and the house was cold in the center, despite the fire. She built the stove back up and brought him soup that afternoon, and wood, and the following morning checked that the stove had held through the night. She did this for 3 days, until Prosser was well enough to see to himself. He said on the last morning, "I did not ask for any of this." She said, "No, you did not." He said, "Are you always like this?" She thought about it. She said, "I suppose I am. I learned it from necessity, and then it became a habit." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. He said, "Well, you can come back if you want." She said she might. She walked back through the November cold with her hands in her coat pockets and counted. 43 days. 17 until Parr's session. That evening after supper, she sat at the table with the scarf in her lap and worked 3 more rows and did not think about Parr. She thought about the rows and the tension of the fiber and the way the color of the wool changed slightly in different parts of the kitchen light, going greener near the window and grayer near the stove. Calvin sat across from her with his papers. After a while, he said, without looking up, "Parr has spoken to Alderman Deary. That is 3. She said, "I know." He looked up then. She said, "I heard Fitch at the store. Weeks ago." He was quiet a moment. She could see something moving behind his expression. Not embarrassment exactly. Something more like the recognition of a man who has underestimated the person sitting across from him and is adjusting his accounting. He said, "You did not say anything." She said, "I was waiting to see what you would do." He said, "And?" She said, "You told me." He said, 4 days late." She said, "Yes, but you told me." She held his gaze. He held hers. She said, "That is not nothing." Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it at the eaves, the particular note it made when the temperature was dropping fast. She stood and added 2 pieces of wood to the stove and adjusted the damper and sat back down. She pulled the next row through. The wool moved through her fingers with the particular evenness that came from having done the same motion thousands of times until it lived in the hands rather than in the mind. She was aware of him watching, not the way Crail or Fletcher or Parr watched from the outside, sorting her into a category. He watched the way you watch a thing you are still deciding about, still taking the measure of, not to judge it, but because you have not yet finished learning its shape. She did not look up. The cat shifted near the stove and resettled. He said, "What is it going to be?" She said, "A scarf." He said, "For who?" She said, "I have not decided." She kept her eyes on the wool. She felt rather than saw something shift in the quality of the silence between them. Not a door opening. Something more preliminary than that. The moment before a hand reaches for a latch. He picked up his papers again. She worked 3 more rows. Then she folded the scarf across her knee, feeling the weight of it, the evenness of the stitches, and she set it on the bench and looked at what she had made so far. It was the color of sage after rain, she thought, though she had not intended that. That was simply where the light in this room took the wool in the evenings, and she had been working in this room in these evenings, and so that was what it had become. She set the scarf on the table between them. She said, "I know about the 60 days. He set down his papers. He looked at the scarf on the table. Then he looked at her. For the first time since she had stepped off the train at Harrow Flat in October, Calvin Marsh looked at her without the careful arrangement of distance he kept between himself and most things. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has stopped being a concept and started being a fact. She waited. He said Ruth was afraid of the dark. She did not answer. She understood that this was not the beginning of a conversation. This was the beginning of something else. He said, "She lit that candle every night from the first winter we were married. Said it was a habit from childhood that she never got out of. I thought it was foolish. I never said so. After she was gone, I kept lighting it because it was the only thing left in the house that was still hers in the same way it had always been hers. Not a photograph, not the quilt, the candle, because a photograph does not do anything and a candle has to be lit. Every night, someone has to light it." He stopped. Outside, the wind pressed at the window glass. She said, "And lighting it was a way of staying with her." He said, "Lighting it was a way of not having left." She understood that. She understood it the way she understood certain wounds, not from the outside, but from the place where it lived. The place that had its own specific gravity. He was not looking at her anymore. He was looking at the table. She said, "My grandmother Oma told me something once. We had a neighbor who had lost everything in one winter: his wife, his crop, his oldest son. He sat by his stove for 3 months and would not be warm. Oma said you cannot take the cold from a man who has decided he deserves it. You can only make the room warm enough that he might eventually choose to let it go. Calvin was quiet for a long time. The fire settled in the stove. The cat did not move. He said, "That is a hard thing to know about yourself." She said, "Most true things are." He looked up at her then, and she let him look, and she did not arrange her face into anything. She was simply there as she had been there for 42 days, doing the work in front of her, and now this was the work in front of her, and she was doing it. He put both hands flat on the table. After a long while, he said, "I should have been there." She said, "Yes." He said, "I have told myself every version of why I was not. None of them help." She said, "No, they would not." He said, "How do you carry a thing like that?" She thought about this. She thought about Heinrich and about her mother and about the farm and about every version of loss she had been asked to carry in 26 years. She said, "You carry it the way you carry anything that is heavier than you think you can manage. One step and then another, and after long enough, you stop noticing you are carrying it because it has become part of the shape of you. And then one day, someone asks you about it, and you realize you have put it down somewhere. You do not know exactly when, but you put it down." He was very still. She picked up the scarf from the table and folded it across her knee and held it there under her hand, feeling the weight of the finished thing. All those rows that had been nothing and were now this. The candle on the windowsill burned low. She watched it for a moment. She said, "Tell me how she fixed the third stair." He looked at her. She said, "You told me Ruth was good with the house. Tell me how she fixed it." And he did, slowly at first, and then with more ease, the way a man talks who has not talked in a very long time and is remembering that it is possible. He told her about the third stair and the particular piece of wood Ruth had found in the shed, and the argument they had about whether it needed to be sanded before setting it in, and how she had been right and he had been wrong, and how she had said nothing about being right. She had simply smiled at the stair the next morning in the particular way that meant she knew. And Natalia listened. The fire burned. The wind worked at the eaves of the house. The cat slept near the stove. He talked for a long time that night. Not everything. Not the way a man empties himself all at once, which was not how grief actually moved. It moved the way water finds its level, slowly through whatever openings were available. He told her about the third stair and about the way Ruth had organized the larder. And he told her that Ruth had never once in 20 years of marriage asked him to come home earlier than the work required, and that this had seemed to him at the time like generosity, and only later like something he had not understood correctly. Natalia listened without filling the spaces between things. When he stopped, she did not summarize what he had said or offer the kind of reflection that would have made it easier for him to dismiss. She simply said goodnight and took her candle and went to the second room and lay in the dark under Ruth's quilt and listened to the wind find its way around the corners of the house. She slept better that night than she had since arriving. She woke to a house that was different in some way she could not immediately name. The cold was the same. The light coming under the door was the same pale gray of every November morning. But there was something in the quality of the silence that had shifted the way a room shifts after a window has been opened and closed again, as if the air inside it has been briefly reminded that another kind of air exists. She rose and dressed and went to the kitchen. The candle holder on the windowsill was empty. not burned down, empty. The holder was there, the plain tin thing with the dent on the left side, but the candle itself was gone. She stood and looked at it for a moment. Then she began laying the fire. She heard him on the stairs. His step was different this morning. She noticed it, without deciding to the way you notice a change in a patient's breathing, before you can say what has changed. He came into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway and looked at the empty holder on the windowsill. He did not look at her. He poured his coffee and stood at the window and looked at the back lot. She made the cornmeal and set it on the table and sat down across from him, and they ate. And the silence between them was the same silence it had always been, and also not the same at all. She did not ask about the candle. He did not explain it. It was not the kind of thing that needed explaining between two people who had spent 43 days learning to read what the other person did not say. He put on his coat at the door and stopped with his hand on the latch. He said, "There is something in the drawer of the bedside table in your room." She looked at him. He said, "I put it there this morning, before you were up." He went out. The door closed. She sat at the table for a moment. Then she went to the second room and opened the drawer. Inside, beside the folded list in Ruth's handwriting, which she had replaced exactly as she had found it and not touched since there was a small brass key on a length of cord. She picked it up and turned it in her fingers. It was a house key. She could tell by the cut of it the particular weight and proportion. She had never had one. The front door had never been locked in all the weeks she had been here. She stood in the second room for a long time, holding the key. He had opened the drawer. He had seen the list there, Ruth's list in Ruth's handwriting, and he had placed the key beside it rather than in spite of it. She put the key in her apron pocket and went back to the kitchen and washed the breakfast dishes and began to think about what the day required. 14 days until Parr's session. 3 nights after that, she could not sleep. She lay in the dark under Ruth's quilt and listened to the house settle and the wind outside, and the particular silence that follows a heavy snow, and at some point past midnight, she rose and lit her candle and went to the drawer of the bedside table. She took out Ruth's list and read it again by candlelight as she had done several times now without consciously deciding to. Flour when low, salt pork wrapped in cloth, not paper, coffee tin on left side of shelf, wood inside before the first frost, loose nail on back step, needs seeing to come spring. Then she reached further back in the drawer to the very rear where she had noticed on her third morning that there was something else pushed all the way to the corner. She had not taken it out before. She was not sure why. Perhaps because she had already found more than she had expected in this drawer, and she had needed time to consider whether she was the kind of person who kept going. She was. She drew out a small wooden box, no larger than a Bible, the kind with a fitted lid that opens by sliding rather than hinging. She held it for a moment, then she opened it. Inside was a bundle of letters, perhaps a dozen, folded and stacked with the careful order of someone who had arranged them more than once. The paper was thin and slightly soft at the edges from handling. She lifted the top one and unfolded it and read the first line. It was addressed to a woman named Harriet in Columbus, Ohio. It was in Ruth's handwriting. She sat on the edge of the cot and read. The letters were not all from the same time. The earliest she found, working through the bundle carefully, was from several years before Ruth's death. A comfortable letter about the garden and the early snow, and a neighbor's new baby. The later ones were different. Their tone was more deliberate, more compressed, the way writing gets when a person knows they are writing toward something and is trying to choose each word for how long it will have to last. The second to last letter said, "I am more tired than I let Calvin know. The doctor is not encouraging, and I have decided not to share what he said in detail because Calvin will stop sleeping and he needs to sleep. He has enough to carry." The last letter said, "I keep thinking about what happens to this house after. Not to Calvin. I know what happens to Calvin. He will work, and he will grieve, and eventually he will be all right because that is who Calvin is. What I think about is the house itself, whether it will become a place where everything is preserved and nothing is allowed to be used. I am afraid it will. I have tried to make it so that it does not have to. I left a list in the drawer. I told someone at the bureau in St. Louis what kind of man he is, what he needs, what the arrangement would have to look like for it to have any chance of working. I cannot do more than that. But Harriet, I am afraid he will not let anyone stay. That is the only thing I am afraid of." The letter was signed. It was not sent. None of them had been sent. They were all still here in this box, in this drawer, in this room where Ruth had slept, and where Natalia now slept under the quilt Ruth had made. She sat with the letters in her lap for a long time. She thought about Ruth writing to the bureau in St. Louis. She thought about Mrs. Pryor, who ran a small office and matched names to needs without sentiment. She thought about the telegram that had found her in Philadelphia on a Tuesday in early October, forwarded 3 times. She folded the last letter with great care and placed it back in the box, and replaced the box at the rear of the drawer exactly as she had found it. Then she placed Ruth's list back on top and closed the drawer and sat with her hands in her lap in the candlelight. "She thought you planned this, Ruth. She thought you arranged the whole of it from a sick bed in Wyoming, sending a letter to a bureau in St. Louis about a man who needed someone capable, and you wrote his description as accurately as you could, and you waited for the right name to come back. And when it did not come in time, you died and left the list in the drawer for whoever arrived." She sat with that for a very long time. She did not feel exactly like the answer to someone else's plan. She felt more precisely like a woman who had been given information she had not expected and was now deciding what to do with it. She went back to bed. In the morning, she said nothing to Calvin about the box or the letters. She made the fire and the coffee and the cornmeal, and she went about the day and she turned the information over in her mind, the way she turned difficult things carefully from all angles without urgency. She would tell him, but not yet. Not before the session. He had enough to carry. She understood now what Ruth had meant by that. 11 days until Parr's session. Edna said on the 14th morning, before the session quietly, while Natalia was setting her coins on the counter, "I have been talking to people." Natalia said, "What kind of people?" Edna said, "The kind who have had occasion to notice what goes on in a town." Natalia said, "And what have they noticed?" Edna looked at her with those pale, direct eyes, and she said, "That the Hendersons' roof was repacked before the last snow, and nobody asked you to do it." Natalia said, "The flashing was coming loose. I could see it from the street." Edna said that Clara Deary had soup on her step 2 mornings running when she was ill, and only one person in this town knew she was ill because Clara Deary does not tell anyone anything. Natalia said nothing. Edna said that the steps outside the post office have had sand on them every icy morning for 3 weeks, and Horace told me he did not put it there. Natalia said someone should have been doing it for years. The angle of that step is wrong. Someone is going to fall. Edna looked at her. She said, "I am making a list." Natalia said, "Of what?" Edna said, "Of what you have done since you arrived, in writing, for the session." Natalia looked at her. She said, "Edna." Edna said, "And I know what you are going to say, and you are wrong. This is not for you. It is for Parr. Parr deals in evidence. He wants to make an argument about what belongs in this town and what does not. I intend to make a better one." Natalia stood with her flour bag in both hands, and she thought about what it would cost Edna to stand up in a room with Gideon Parr and 3 other men who had all been in this town longer than either of them. She said, "You understand what he will do to you after?" Edna said, "Parr has been trying to get me off this corner for 6 years because he wants the lot for a land office. He has not managed it yet." She said it the way a woman says something she has already finished being afraid of. Natalia nodded once. She picked up her bag and walked back to the house in the thin December light. And she thought about the list Edna was making, and about the key in her apron pocket, and about the letters in the wooden box in the drawer of the bedside table. And she thought about Ruth, who had been afraid of the dark, and had written letters she could not send, and had arranged from a sickbed for someone capable to arrive at the right door. She thought, "I have not yet decided if I am staying." She thought, "I have not yet decided if that is still a decision I am making." That evening Calvin came in and sat down across from her with a piece of paper in his hand. He set it on the table between them. It was a copy of the notice from the town council. Formal session dated. Agenda item listed as matter of public conduct and residential arrangement. Calvin Marsh, Sheriff. Her name was not on it. She said, "They did not put my name." He said, "You are not a resident of record. You have no standing in the proceeding." She looked at the paper. She said, "So I cannot speak." He said, "You can be there. That is all." She thought about all the rooms in her life where she had been permitted to be present, but not to speak. Kitchens where she was not introduced to guests. Parlors where decisions were made around her as if she were not standing in them. The bank in Philadelphia that had spoken to Heinrich's brother about the account rather than to her. She had always found a way to be heard in those rooms without being called on through the quality of her presence, through what she did rather than what she said. She looked at Calvin. She said, "What will you do?" He said, "I will go to the session." She said, "And say what?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I will say what is true." She said, "What is true is not always what is useful in a room like that." He said, "I know, but it is what I have." She looked at him. She thought about the man who had lit a candle every night for 4 years, and then one morning had put the candle away without being asked. She thought about the house key on the cord in her apron pocket. She thought about Ruth's last letter. She said, "All right." She went back to the mending. She had been putting off a hem that had needed doing for a week. He sat at the table for a while with his hands flat on the surface. After a while, he went upstairs. She heard the floor above settle under his weight and then go quiet. She set down the mending. She went to the second room and opened the drawer and took out the wooden box and sat on the edge of the cot and held it in her hands for a moment. Then she put it back in the drawer and took out only Ruth's list and sat with it in the candlelight and read it one more time. Flour when low. Salt pork wrapped in cloth, not paper. Coffee tin on left side of shelf. Wood inside before the first frost. Loose nail on back step needs seeing to come spring. She thought about what it meant to write a list for someone you would never meet. She folded it carefully and placed it back and closed the drawer. Then she went back to the kitchen and picked up the scarf from the bench where she had finished it the evening before and carried it to the table and set it in the center where he would see it in the morning. She stood with her hands at her sides and looked at it there on the table, the color of it in the lamplight, the weight of the thing that had been nothing and was now this. She had stopped counting at some point in the last week. She was not sure exactly when. Somewhere after 48 and before 58, the counting had simply become unnecessary, the way you stop checking the clock when you have stopped needing to know what time it is. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and thought about the session in 4 days, and about Ruth, and about the key in her apron pocket, and about what it meant that she had put it in her pocket rather than hung it on the nail by the door, and she decided that she knew what it meant, and that she would deal with what it meant when the time came. She was not afraid. She had established that to herself some time ago. What she felt was something closer to the particular alertness that comes before a procedure, when you have done everything you can do in preparation and all that remains is to be steady when the moment arrives. She was good at that. She always had been. The session was held on a Thursday afternoon in the back room of the town hall, which was also used for quarterly land disputes and the occasional probate hearing. Natalia walked there beside Calvin through the December cold, which had come down hard in the past week and made the street sound different underfoot, the particular compression of frozen ground that is different from snow and different from mud and carries its own distinct note beneath the boot. She wore her good coat, the dark wool one, and her better hat, not because she was dressing for anyone in the room, but because she had learned long ago that how you carried yourself into a difficult place said something before you opened your mouth. The room held perhaps 30 people, more than she had expected. She recognized faces from the church and from Edna's store and from the street. Clara Deary was there in the second row, sitting upright and composed in the way of a woman who has made a decision and is carrying it out. Horace from the post office. The Hendersons, both of them, the husband with his hat in his lap, and the wife with her hands folded over her coat buttons. Young Mrs. Aldrich, whose boy she had stitched 3 weeks ago, sitting in the back row with the child beside her. Old Prosser, who she had not expected to see, who had walked the north distance through the December cold, and was now sitting near the door with the careful stillness of a man conserving his strength for what the morning had cost him. Gideon Parr sat at the front table with 2 other aldermen. Alderman Deary, who was Clara's husband, sat at the far end of the table and had not met Natalia's eyes the 2 times she had encountered him in the street. He did not meet them now either. Alderman Foss sat at the near end with the expression of a man who has already decided something and is waiting for the formality to catch up with him. Reverend Crail sat to one side, not at the table, which she noted with care. Parr was a large man who carried his size like a credential. He had the kind of face that communicated authority as its primary purpose, and he looked at Calvin when they entered and then at Natalia with the look of a man who has already categorized you and is simply confirming the categorization before proceeding. She looked back at him steadily and then found a seat in the 3rd row beside Edna Whitlock. Edna had a piece of paper folded in her lap. She did not look at Natalia when she sat down. She was looking at the front of the room with the focused attention of someone who is counting exits and calculating distances. The session opened. Parr spoke at length about the responsibilities of public officials and the expectations of the community they served, and the importance of maintaining a standard of conduct consistent with the position of trust held by a man who carried a badge in a town that had placed its confidence in him. He said these things in the careful language of a man who has rehearsed them, and he said them without looking at Natalia, which she understood was deliberate. Not looking at her made her a subject rather than a person in the room. It was a technique she had encountered before in rooms that had not wanted her there. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and she looked at the front of the room without expression. Calvin stood when Parr finished. He did not speak the way she had expected. She had half anticipated the language of defense of a man explaining himself to people who held something over him managing the room by managing his own position in it. He did not do that. He stood with his hat in both hands, and he spoke quietly and without arrangement. He said, "I have served this town for 11 years. In that time, I have made decisions that were not popular, and I have held positions that cost me something, and I have tried to do the work as I understood it. I am not going to stand here and defend my household to a man whose interest in my conduct began when I declined to sell him the North Parcel 3 years ago." Parr said, "That is not relevant to the matter at hand." Calvin said, "I think it is exactly the matter at hand. I think the rest of it is language put around that to make it look like something else." There was a stillness in the room. Parr said, "The question before this body is whether the arrangement in your home meets the standard appropriate to a man in your position." Calvin reached into his coat and removed a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly. He said, "Before I say anything further, I would like to read one sentence, with the permission of the person it concerns." He looked at Natalia. She nodded once. He said, "This is from a letter written by my wife Ruth in the last weeks of her life, addressed to her sister in Ohio." He paused. He said, "Do not let the house become a place that no one is allowed to enter." He refolded the paper and put it back in his coat. He said, "That is what I have to say." He sat down. The room was very quiet. Parr looked at the other aldermen. Deary was looking at his hands. Foss had the expression of a man who is reconsidering. Then Edna Whitlock stood up. She did not look at Parr. She held her folded paper in one hand, and she turned slightly so that she was addressing the room rather than the table, the way a person addresses a room when they understand that the decision is not actually being made at the table. She said, "I have a list. I would like to read it." Parr said, "This is not an open forum, Mrs. Whitlock." Edna said, "Then I will read it quickly." She read it. She read the names and the dates and the specific things, the Henderson roof and the section of flashing, and the morning Natalia had gone up there before breakfast with the tools from Calvin's box, before anyone had thought to ask. Clara Deary and the soup, and the 2 mornings running, and the fact that Clara Deary does not tell anyone when she is ill, and the one person who had noticed without being told. She read about the post office steps and the sand, and the 3 weeks of icy mornings and Horace's statement that he had not put it there. She read about the child with the cut hand, and the 3 stitches placed with a fine needle and steady hands, and the instructions given to the mother that the mother herself had said were better than what the doctor had previously managed. She read about Mr. Prosser, in the 3 days of soup and wood. In the morning she had found him with a cold house and a failing stove, and had rebuilt it without being asked and without mentioning it to anyone. She read 6 more items. Then she set the paper on the table in front of Parr. She said, "That is what has come out of that house since October. That is what this town has received from the stranger at the gate that Reverend Crail was so concerned about." She sat down. Alderman Deary looked up from his hands. He looked at his wife Clara in the second row. Clara was looking straight at him, not with accusation, simply looking the way a person looks at someone they have been married to long enough that a look can carry the weight of a conversation. Deary looked back at the table. Foss said I moved to close the agenda item. Deary said without looking up. Seconded. Parr said, "There has not been a vote." Foss said, "There has been enough." Parr looked at the room. He was a man who dealt in calculations, and he was calculating now, adding the faces and the postures and the weight of 30 people who had come to a Thursday afternoon meeting. In December cold, and what he was calculating was whether the number had moved past where he could still make it work. It had. He said, "The item is tabled." She understood what that meant. Tabled meant it could return. But she also understood that in practical terms, what it meant was that Parr had looked at the room and decided the cost of continuing today was higher than what he stood to gain, and that a man who makes that calculation once will eventually make it again about the same subject, and that this particular door was now harder to open than it had been this morning. Crail stood as people were rising from their seats. He spoke without preamble. He said, "I have not been helpful in this matter. I intend to be more useful going forward." He looked at Natalia when he said it. She looked back at him. She nodded. It was enough. She did not speak to anyone else in the room. She waited for Calvin, and they walked out together through the December cold, and the street was quiet, the way it is after something has happened that everyone will talk about for some time, and neither of them said anything for a long while. At the gate, he unlocked it and held it, and she walked through. She realized as she walked through it that she had been holding the house key in her gloved hand since somewhere on the walk from the town hall. She had not decided to take it out. Her hand had simply done it the way the body sometimes knows what it is doing before the mind has caught up. She went inside before him. She hung her coat on the hook beside his and set her hat on the shelf. She put the kettle on. She heard him at the door, the particular sound of him checking the latch twice, which he always did, which she had long since stopped noticing consciously, because it had become part of the rhythm of the house, like the way the stove ticked when it was heating, and the way the cottonwood moved in the east wind. He came in and stood near the stove. She was at the window looking out at the back lot where the wood was stacked against the fence, and the last of the December light was going blue on the snow. The cottonwood was bare against the sky. The fence posts had an inch of white along the top rail. He said Natalia. She had not heard him use her full name before. He used it the way you use a thing you have been waiting for the right occasion to use. She turned. He was looking at the shelf where the gray wool had sat for weeks. The shelf was empty. He looked at the table. The scarf was not there either. He looked at the bench. He looked at her. She said, "I put it in your coat this morning, left pocket, before you went out." He reached into the left pocket of the coat hanging on the hook beside hers. He took out the scarf. It was folded the way she folded things, neat and without excess. He held it in both hands and looked at it. The color of it in the kitchen light, that gray-green that was neither one thing nor the other, the thing the light in this room had made of the wool over all those evenings. He said, "You said you did not know who it was for." She said I did not, at the time. He was quiet. He held the scarf in both hands, and she could see him, with it the weight of it, something moving behind his expression that she had not seen before. She turned back to the window. She heard him behind her, the small sound of the scarf being placed somewhere, and then his footsteps across the room. He stopped behind her, not close, not far, and she felt the particular quality of his standing there, the way the air in a room changes when someone has decided to occupy a part of it they have not occupied before. She looked at the back lot, the blue dark of the snow, the wood pile, the bare fence, the sky above going from gray to the first dark of evening. He said, "The drawer in your room." She said, "Yes." He said, "I put the key in there this morning. I saw what else was in the drawer." She waited. He said, "The list." "I had not opened that drawer since she was gone." She said, "I know." A long silence. He said, "There was something else in there. She said, "Yes." He said I did not look further than the list. I put the key down and I left. She turned from the window then. She looked at him. She said, "There is a box at the back of the drawer." Letters Ruth wrote to her sister in Ohio. She did not send them. They were still there. He was very still. She said, "I want to show you something in one of them. Not tonight. When you are ready." There is something she wrote that I think you should know, but it will keep, and there is no urgency to it, and tonight has been a long day. He looked at her for a moment. He said, "All right," she said, "all right." She went to the stove and poured the water that had been on too long into the pot, and set out the 2 cups. She put his at the far end of the counter where he could reach it, and she held hers in both hands and stood near the stove, where the heat was building after the cold of the afternoon. The cat came from the direction of the second room and sat near her feet, with the expression of an animal that has, after considerable deliberation, committed to a position. She looked down at it. She had been waiting to see if it would name itself. Cats sometimes did if you gave them enough time. The cat looked back at her. She said, "Well?" The cat blinked once, the slow, deliberate blink that means something in a cat's particular language. She picked it up carefully, the way she handled anything uncertain of being handled, and it tensed briefly, and then settled a significant warmth and weight against her chest. And she stood at the stove and held it, and the heat came off the iron in slow, steady waves. Calvin sat at the table with his coffee. He had not taken the scarf off. She did not comment on this. Outside, the dark had settled fully over Harrow Flat. The street was empty. A door somewhere. A horse in the livery. The small sounds of a place that expected the night to proceed as nights did. She set the cat down on the rug near the stove, and it resettled with the air of something that had made a final determination. She sat at the table, not at her usual end, closer in than usual, not because she had planned to, simply because that was where she pulled the chair from, and she pulled it from there without thinking about it, which was itself a kind of answer to a question she had not been fully aware she was still asking. He looked at the table. She looked at the table. The lamp threw its ordinary circle of yellow light over the grain of the wood between them. After a while, she said, "Tomorrow, if you want, I can show you what is in the box." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Yes, tomorrow." She nodded. The following morning, she woke before him, which was ordinary, and made the fire and the coffee and waited at the table. When he came downstairs, she could see that he had not slept particularly well, which she had expected because she had not slept particularly well either. Both of them lying in their separate rooms in the same house, thinking about the same box in the same drawer. She went to the second room and retrieved the wooden box and brought it to the table and set it down between them. She said, "I found it the 3rd week. I should have told you sooner. I was waiting until after the session because you had enough to manage." He looked at the box. He said, "Ruth made this. Years ago. It was her mother's before." She said, "I did not know that." He reached out and picked it up and held it. The way you hold something you have not touched in a long time and are not sure yet what it is going to cost you. He opened it. He took out the bundle of letters and set the box down and held the letters and looked at them for a moment. Then he began to read. She went to the stove and checked the coffee and added wood to the fire and gave him the room in the way she had learned to give room, by being present without requiring anything from the presence, by staying close enough that silence had company, without the company requiring management. He read for a long time. She heard him set a letter down, pick up another, set it down. At some point she heard him make a sound she had heard once before throughout the night he had talked about Ruth and the stair. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. Something that had been held in a very long time and was finding its way out in the only form still available to it. She did not go to him. She stood at the stove and let it be what it was. After a long while, he said without turning. She wrote to the bureau. She said, "Yes." He said, "She told them what to look for." She said, "Yes." He was quiet. He said, "She knew someone would come." She said, "She arranged for someone to come." There is a difference. Another long silence. He said, "She was not afraid of me moving on." She said, "No." She was afraid you would not allow it. There is also a difference there. He turned then. He was holding the last letter. She could see from across the room that his eyes were wet, which she had not seen before, and which she observed without comment, because some things do not require comment. He said, "She says I had enough to carry." Natalia said, "You did." He said, "She always knew things about me that I had not said." She said, "Yes. From what you have told me, she seems to have been that kind of person." He set the letter down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something that has weight you did not anticipate. He put his hand flat on it for a moment, then he took his hand away. He said, "She was right about the nail on the back step." Natalia felt something loosen slightly in her chest, a tension she had been holding without being entirely aware of holding it. She said, "She was right about most things, it sounds like." He made the sound again, closer to a laugh this time. He said, "She was." She would not have said so, but she was. He gathered the letters carefully and replaced them in the box and closed it. He sat with the box between his hands for a moment. Then he stood and carried it upstairs. She heard his footsteps above, and then the sound of a drawer opening and closing. When he came back downstairs, his face was composed and clear in the way of someone who has set something down and is deciding to leave it where they put it. He sat at the table. She put a fresh cup of coffee in front of him and sat across from him, and they looked at each other for a moment across the ordinary kitchen table, in the ordinary morning light, and something passed between them that she did not have a word for in English and suspected did not require one. He said, "What do you need?" She considered the question. It was the right question asked in the right way, which was directly and without the kind of softening that would have made it easier to deflect. She said, "I need the back step seen to in the spring. Properly, not patched. I found a length of pine in the shed." He said, "I have been saving it." She said, "I know. I would like it used for the step." He said, "All right," she said, "and I would like to write to my brother Elias. I have not told him where I am." He said, "All right," she said, "and I would like to hang the key on the nail by the door, beside yours." He looked at her. She reached into her apron pocket and set the brass key on the table between them. He looked at it for a long moment. He said, "Yes." She picked it up and stood and crossed to the door and hung it on the second nail, the one that had been empty since she arrived beside his. It hung there against the wood with a small, definite sound. She stood for a moment looking at the two keys on the two nails. Then she turned around. He was still at the table. He had the scarf in his hands she saw picked up from where he had set it down the evening before. He was not wearing it. He was simply holding it, looking at the color of it, that gray-green, the color of this room in the evening, with the lamp burning. She said, "It is off in color." He said, "I think so too." Neither of them moved for a moment. The cat was on the rug near the stove. The lamp was burning. The two keys were on the two nails. Outside, the December morning was doing what December mornings do in Wyoming, proceeding with the particular indifference of weather to the significance of what occurs beneath it. She said, "There is dried apple in the larder. I thought I might make something with it today if the weather keeps." He said, "That would be all right." She picked up her mending from the bench, the hem she had finally finished the night before, and she sat at the table and picked up the fine scissors from their cloth case, and looked at the last stitches she had set even, and closed the thread ends needing trimming. She thought about Oma pressing these scissors into her hands the morning she left for Philadelphia. She thought about the things the hands remember after the mind has moved on to other things. She thought about the rows of a scarf built one at a time in a kitchen in Wyoming through the evenings of a November that had asked more of her than she had fully anticipated and less than she had feared. She clipped the thread ends clean. She set the mended hem on the bench and set the scissors back in their cloth case and closed it. She looked across the table at Calvin Marsh, who had put the scarf across his knee and was now reading his papers with one hand resting on the wool, the way a person keeps a hand on something they are not ready to put away, which was its own kind of answer to a question that had been sitting between them since the evening she had set it on the table. She was not in a hurry. She had learned, over 26 years in a marriage cut short, in the particular education of grief, that the things that lasted were not the things that arrived quickly. They were the things you built one day at a time, one small decision at a time, in rooms that were cold and ordinary, and asked nothing of you except that you keep showing up to them. She thought about Elias and the letter she would write him this afternoon. She thought about what she would say and what she would not say, and she decided she would tell him something true, which she had not managed in any letter she had written since Heinrich died. Something about what it meant to find a place that fit you at the age when you had stopped expecting to find one. Something about floors that hold your weight when you walk on them. Something about the difference between a place that is yours and a place where you exist, and how she had not fully understood that difference until she had been in a place where it was possible again. She would find the words. She had always been able to find them when she sat down with the paper. He set down his papers and looked at the stove. The cat had moved to the chair near the window and was sitting in the pale winter sun that came through the glass at this hour and would be gone by noon. She said, "The cat needs a name." He looked at the cat. He said, "She has been here 6 years without one." She said, "That seems long enough." He looked at the cat for a moment with the expression of a man being asked to take a position on something he has avoided having a position on for some time. He said, "What would you call her?" Natalia looked at the cat in the winter sun. The torn ear. The gray of her, the particular shade of it, neither dark nor light. She said, "Ruth." The silence after that was the kind that is not empty. He looked at the cat. He looked at Natalia. He looked at the table between them. He said, "Yes." "All right." She nodded. That afternoon, after the noon meal, while Calvin was out on his rounds and the house was quiet, with the particular quality of a winter afternoon that has settled into itself, she sat at the table with a sheet of paper and a pen, and she wrote to Elias. She had not written to him since October, a short letter telling him only that she had arrived safely somewhere and that she was well, and that she would write again when she had more to say. She had not had more to say until now, or rather, she had had more to say, but had not yet decided how to say it, which was a different problem. She sat for a moment with the pen in her hand and the paper in front of her, and the pale winter light coming through the east window, and she thought about what was true, and what Elias needed to know, and whether those were the same things. They were not entirely the same things. but there was enough overlap to begin. She wrote, "Dear Elias, I am in Harrow Flat, Wyoming, which is a small town in the Basin Country northwest of Cheyenne. I have been here since the first week of October. I am settled and I am well, and this is the first time I have been able to write those two things in the same sentence and mean both of them." She stopped and looked at what she had written. She thought about how to say the rest of it without making it sound like more than it was or less than it was, which was the particular difficulty of writing to a brother you love and who will worry and who you do not want to worry more than is necessary. She wrote, "I want to tell you something true, which I have not always managed in letters. I left Philadelphia without telling you where I was going, because I did not know yet, and I did not want to explain something I had not yet decided. I am decided now. I am in Wyoming, and I am staying at least through the winter, and I wanted you to know where I am. What I have found here is the first place in some time that feels like it might belong to me in the way that places do when you are not a guest in them." She stopped again. She thought about what else to say. She thought about Calvin and about Ruth's letters and about the key on the nail by the door, and she decided that those things were not for this letter. Not yet, not until she understood them better. Herself. She wrote, "There is a lot I do not yet know about what this is or where it leads. I am 26 years old, and I have been in enough uncertain situations to know that uncertainty is not the same as danger, and that not knowing the shape of something does not mean the shape is wrong. I am being sensible. I am working. The work here is good work, and the people here are mostly people I am glad to know. That is more than I could have told you about Philadelphia." She wrote, "Write to me when you can. I would like to know how you are. Not what you owe, or what you plan, or what went wrong. Just how you are. I am your sister, and I am allowed to want that much." She signed it the way she had always signed letters to Elias, with her full name, Natalia, which she had done from the first letter she ever wrote him, because she had wanted him to know who he was writing to, and she had never found a reason to change the habit. She folded the letter and addressed the envelope and set it on the shelf beside the tin of coffee, where she would see it in the morning and remember to take it to the post office. Then she sat for another moment with her hands in her lap and looked at the east window and the white of the December sky through the glass. She thought about Ruth sitting in this room, or perhaps at this very table, writing letters she could not send. She thought about the particular loneliness of that writing to someone you love, about things you cannot yet say to them, directly putting words on paper, because the paper will hold them when you cannot. She understood that loneliness. She had lived in varieties of it for most of her life. But she also thought that Ruth had found in that loneliness a way to do something useful. A bureau in St. Louis, a telegram forwarded 3 times, a woman on a train from Philadelphia with a small iron skillet and a ball of gray wool, and 26 years of knowing that standing upright is a decision. She picked up the next piece of mending from the basket and held it in the lamplight and found where she needed to begin. He reached for his papers when he returned at dusk, sitting across from her at the table in the familiar way, his coat on the hook beside hers, his hat on the shelf, his hands around the coffee cup she had set in front of him without being asked, because this was the rhythm now, and neither of them had decided it, and neither of them needed to. The fire settled in the stove with a low sound. The cat slept in the winter sun that had moved across the floor all afternoon and was now gone, leaving the cat sleeping in the place where it had been, which was what cats did. The lamp burned. Outside, the snow came down over all of Harrow Flat, over the street and the church, and Edna Whitlock's store with its lamp already lit against the gray of the morning over the town hall, where a piece of paper had been set on a table the day before, and then set aside over the north parcel that Gideon Parr would not get because the man who held it had no reason now to be replaced. Over the post office steps, where the